After years of relentless campaigns, led by officers like George Crook, the situation in the Southwest had reached a breaking point that no one side could ignore anymore. The Apache, once spread across vast territories and moving freely through mountains and deserts, were now being steadily compressed into reservation boundaries that felt nothing like home and everything like confinement. It was not just a military shift happening during the early 1870s, it was a total reshaping of life itself. Food systems, movement, leadership structures, spiritual practices, even the meaning of survival. By this point, Crook's strategy had achieved something that earlier Spanish and Mexican campaigns never fully managed. It wasn't outright destruction of the Apache people, but exhaustion. Constant pursuit had become the weapon. Winter campaigns cut into their ability to hide in the mountains. Apache scouts working for the U.S. Army made it increasingly difficult for bands to remain invisible in their own land. And the combination of hunger, displacement, and broken seasons of peace agreements began to wear down even the most determined leaders. When Apache groups were brought onto reservations in the early 1870s, many of them did so not because they had accepted American authority, but because the alternative had become starvation or endless flight. But the reservation system, which American officials described as a solution, quickly revealed itself to be something far more unstable. These are not self-sustaining communities. They were dependent systems controlled from a distance by political decisions made in Washington, filtered through layers of corruption, misunderstanding, and logistical failure. Rations often arrived late or not at all. When they did arrive, they were frequently insufficient or spoiled. Agents responsible for distribution sometimes diverted supplies for profit, while soldiers on the ground saw the Apache as an ongoing security problem rather than a population to be supported. And beneath all of this was a deeper issue that no policy could easily solve. The Apache were being asked to stop being Apache in the way they had always understood themselves. Their economy had always been a mix of hunting, gathering, seasonal movement, trade, and raiding when necessary. On reservations, movement was restricted. Hunting grounds were no longer accessible. Traditional gathering cycles were disrupted. Even when farming was introduced, it often failed due to poor soil, unfamiliar climates, or lack of proper tools and knowledge transfer that matched Apache environmental understanding. And so, what developed was not stability, but tension that slowly built beneath the surface. At the same time, Apache leaders were not unified in their response. Some saw accommodation as the only realistic path forward. Others believed continued resistance, even in reduced form, was necessary to preserve dignity and autonomy. And still others moved between both positions depending on circumstances, negotiations, and betrayals. This internal diversity of response is crucial to understanding what happens next. Because Apache resistance was never a single unified war, it was a shifting pattern of decisions made by independent bands under extreme pressure. George Crook himself was aware that the situation was not simply military. He had seen enough of frontier warfare to understand that force alone did not produce lasting peace. So his approach combined pressure with negotiation. He offered amnesty to those who surrendered. He used Apache scouts not just for tracking, but also as a way of understanding internal Apache movements and motivations. And for a brief moment in the mid-1870s, it appeared that this hybrid approach might stabilize the region. Some Apache groups did settle into periods of relative peace on reservations. Certain leaders tried to build new lives under the constraints they were given, hoping that adaptation might preserve at least part of their people's future. But the system they were entering was fragile, and more importantly, it was not trusted. Trust had been broken too many times across Spanish, Mexican, and now American periods. Every promise of safety carried the memory of past betrayals. And then, even within this fragile balance, something began to shift again in the late 1870s. George Crook was temporarily reassigned, and with his departure, the pressure that had kept some order in place began to loosen. At the same time, reservation conditions in several areas worsened. Supplies became more inconsistent. Local tensions between settlers, military personnel, and Apache communities increased. And small groups of Apache began leaving reservations again, not always as a coordinated rebellion, but often as families or bands simply choosing to leave conditions they saw as unbearable. These departures were not always violent at first. Sometimes they began as attempts to return to traditional lands, to gather food, or reconnect with sacred areas. But once outside reservation boundaries, these groups were immediately treated as hostile, and military responses followed. What might have been small, localized movements of survival quickly escalated into renewed cycles of pursuit and conflict. It is in this environment that one of the most important and complex figures in Apache history begins to re-emerge into larger historical focus, a man known as Geronimo, an individual whose life was shaped entirely by the long chain of conflict, loss, and resistance that defined the Apache experience in the 19th century. Geronimo had already lived through profound personal trauma by this point. His family had been killed in earlier Mexican conflicts, an event that deeply influenced his worldview and his willingness to resist both Mexican and later American forces. But he was not simply a product of revenge. He was also operating within a cultural and political reality where survival itself often required mobility, unpredictability, and resistance to external control. By the late 1870s, Geronimo was not yet the most prominent Apache leader, but he was part of a growing number of individuals and small bands who refused to accept reservation confinement as permanent. These groups operated in the borderlands between reservation life and open resistance, moving across difficult terrain, relying on knowledge of water sources, mountain passes, and remote valleys that were often inaccessible to larger military units. The American military response to these movements became increasingly coordinated. Instead of large sweeping campaigns, the strategy shifted toward persistent tracking, using Apache scouts, cavalry units, and increasingly detailed knowledge of Apache geography. The goal was no longer just battlefield victory. It was continuous pressure, removing the ability of small groups to rest, resupply, or establish stability outside reservation control. What developed during this period was a kind of constant low-intensity war. It was not always marked by large battles, but by movement, pursuit, and survival. Apache groups that left reservations had to remain mobile almost constantly. Military units had to maintain extended field operations in harsh terrain. And civilians in frontier regions lived in a state of ongoing fear and uncertainty, where raids and counter-raids could erupt with little warning. But even within this escalating tension, there were still moments where peace seemed possible. Negotiations continued intermittently. Some Apache leaders returned to reservations under promises of improved conditions. Others tested agreements, trying to see if coexistence could be made workable. And figures like Crook himself sometimes returned to command roles, attempting again to stabilize the situation through a combination of enforcement and diplomacy. When Crook returned to command in the early 1880s, he once again tried to implement a system that balanced military pressure with negotiated settlement. He met directly with Apache leaders. He promised better rations, improved reservation conditions, and more autonomy within boundaries if resistance ended. And for a short period, it appeared that some of these agreements might hold. But beneath these agreements, structural problems remained unchanged. The reservation system still failed to consistently provide for basic needs. Local conflicts with settlers continued. And perhaps most importantly, there remained a deep cultural divide in understanding what peace even meant. For American officials, peace meant permanent settlement and cessation of movement. For many Apache groups, peace meant freedom of movement and respect for autonomy. These definitions were not compatible. And so, once again, the system began to break. By the early 1880s, small groups began leaving reservations again. Some of these departures were led or joined by Geronimo and other resistant leaders. What followed was not a single unified uprising, but a series of interconnected movements across difficult terrain, stretching across what is now Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. These groups often moved south into Mexico itself, where terrain familiarity and cross-border mobility offered temporary refuge from U.S. military pursuit. This cross-border movement created one of the most difficult challenges for American military forces. Apache groups could evade U.S. troops by moving into Mexico, but Mexican authorities also struggled to control or track these bands effectively. As a result, pursuit operations sometimes extended across international boundaries, creating diplomatic tension and adding another layer of complexity to an already unstable situation. During these years, the Apache resistance became smaller in number but highly effective in mobility and evasion. They were no longer fighting to control territory in a traditional sense. At the same time, the U.S. military began to refine its most effective strategy yet, which was not simply pursuit, but psychological exhaustion. The idea was to make continued resistance so difficult, so constantly disruptive, that even the most determined groups would eventually choose surrender. This meant continuous tracking, rapid response to any movement, and removal of any safe zones where Apache groups might rest or regroup. And this strategy began to take effect. By the mid-1880s, the number of Apache groups still actively resisting in the field had significantly decreased. Many had returned to reservations under promises of improved conditions. Others had been captured or killed in military engagements. And those who remained, including Geronimo and his small group of followers, found themselves increasingly isolated, constantly moving, and under relentless pursuit from multiple directions. What was emerging now was the final phase of the Apache Wars, not a large-scale war of armies, but a prolonged pursuit of a small group that refused to surrender completely, even when survival itself became almost impossible to maintain under constant pressure. By the early 1880s, the Apache struggle had entered its final and most intense phase, where survival itself became the main form of resistance, and the United States military had shifted from trying to defeat large forces to hunting down small, highly mobile groups across an impossible landscape. When these groups returned to reservations in 1883, the United States government and military leadership viewed it as a major success. It appeared that decades of conflict were finally moving toward resolution. But beneath the surface, the same structural issues that had defined earlier failures still existed. Reservation conditions were inconsistent, trust remained fragile, and communication between Apache communities and American authorities was still shaped by misunderstanding and broken expectations. Crook himself recognized the fragility of this peace. He understood that without sustained improvements in reservation life and a consistent policy of trust, these agreements would not hold. And for a brief moment, there was relative calm in the region, a rare pause in decades of continuous conflict. But that pause did not last. In 1885, a group of Apache leaders, including Geronimo, Nate, and others left the reservation once again. The reasons for this departure were complex, rooted in both immediate conditions and long historical memory. Reports of dissatisfaction with reservation management, fears of punishment for earlier actions, and deep distrust of American promises all contributed to the decision. What followed was one of the most famous and final chapters in Apache resistance history. A small group of roughly a few dozen warriors, along with families, leaving reservation boundaries and entering a period of intense flight and pursuit that would last for more than a year. This was not a large-scale war anymore. It was a mobile survival campaign across an enormous region spanning Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. The group moved constantly, often splitting into smaller units, rejoining later, and relying on knowledge of water sources, hidden trails, and remote mountain refuges that allowed them to stay ahead of larger military forces. Their ability to evade capture during this period became legendary even among American military officers. Entire regiments were deployed to track them. Telegraph lines were used to coordinate movement across territories. Forts were placed strategically across likely routes of escape. And yet, despite this increasingly sophisticated system of pursuit, the group remained elusive. In 1885, The United States replaced Crook as commander in the region with General Nelson Miles, a more aggressive and centralized military leader who believed that Crook's negotiation-based approach had allowed resistance to continue longer than necessary. Miles represented a shift in strategy. Where Crook had combined diplomacy with force, Miles leaned heavily toward total military pressure designed to eliminate the possibility of continued resistance entirely. Miles expanded the use of coordinated columns of troops, rapid communication, and deep penetration into Mexican territory when necessary to track Apache movements. The goal was no longer to negotiate surrender in the field, but to force it through continuous pursuit and exhaustion. At the same time, Apache scouts remained a critical part of the system. Their ability to interpret signs in terrain, track movements across dry ground, and predict Apache decision-making patterns made them indispensable. But this also meant that the final stage of the Apache Wars was marked by an almost total transparency of movement, where hiding became increasingly impossible. For Geronimo's group, this period was defined by constant motion. They crossed borders repeatedly, moving into Mexico to escape pressure from U.S. forces, then returning north when Mexican forces increased pressure on them there. They survived through a combination of raiding, gathering, and careful avoidance of large settlements, but every movement carried risk. By 1886, the situation had reached its final stage. The group had been reduced in size, continuously pursued, and cut off from any stable base of operations. Supplies were limited. Fatigue was extreme, and the military forces pursuing them had been expanded to a level that made continued evasion increasingly difficult. One of the key figures in the final pursuit was General Miles himself, who coordinated a wide-ranging campaign designed to close every possible escape route. Instead of focusing on single engagements, Miles structured the pursuit as a system, with multiple columns moving simultaneously to compress available movement space. At the same time, Apache scouts working with the U.S. Army provided critical intelligence on movement patterns, helping predict where small groups might attempt to rest or resupply. This combination of mobility, pressure, and intelligence gathering gradually reduced the ability of Geronimo's group to maintain effective evasion. In August 1886, after months of pursuit, negotiations, and exhaustion, a final meeting was arranged between Geronimo's group and American military representatives near Skeleton Canyon on the Arizona-Mexico border. The conditions leading to this meeting were not simple surrender in the traditional sense, but the culmination of years of exhaustion, dwindling options, and the recognition that continued flight could no longer sustain life in any stable form. When Geronimo and Nate met with General Miles, the terms of surrender effectively ended organized Apache resistance in the field. The agreement promised relocation and imprisonment rather than continued freedom or reservation return. It was not a peace treaty in the sense of mutual understanding, but a military conclusion to a prolonged campaign of pursuit. With this surrender in 1886, the long era of Apache armed resistance effectively came to an end. What remained was no longer a war of movement and survival in the field, but a new phase of history centered on imprisonment, relocation, and the transformation of Apache identity under American control. But even though the fighting in the field had ended, the consequences of everything that had happened over the previous 3 centuries were far from over. The Apache people would continue to exist, adapt, resist in new ways, and preserve identity under conditions of confinement and change. And the legacy of their resistance would become one of the most powerful and enduring stories in the history of the American Southwest. When the final surrender happened in 1886, it did not bring peace in the way the Apache had ever understood peace. What it brought instead was the end of movement, the end of independence in the field, and the beginning of a new kind of struggle that would not be fought with raids or pursuit anymore, but with confinement, relocation, and the slow attempt to reshape an entire people inside systems they did not design and did not trust. For the United States military, the surrender of Geronimo and the last resisting groups was considered the closing chapter of decades of frontier warfare. But almost immediately after the surrender, decisions were made that revealed something important about how the conflict was still being understood. Instead of allowing the surrendered Apache to return to their reservation homeland in Arizona, military leadership decided that they should be removed entirely from the region where resistance had taken place. The reasoning was strategic from the American military perspective. Leaders like General Nelson Miles believed that keeping the Apache in their familiar territories would only create the conditions for renewed escape and resistance. If they were relocated far away, it would be easier to control, supervise, and gradually integrate them into the system the government had been trying to impose for decades. So instead of returning home, the surrendered Apache were treated as prisoners of war and transported across long distances into unfamiliar and often harsh environments in the southeastern United States. The first major destination was Fort Marion in Florida, a place far removed from the deserts and mountains of the Southwest. The journey itself was disorienting. Families were separated in many cases. Warriors who had spent their entire lives moving freely across vast landscapes were now confined to guarded trains and military transport routes, moving toward a coastal environment that bore no resemblance to anything they had known. At Fort Marion, the Apache found themselves in a completely new reality. The fort had originally been designed for earlier conflicts, but now it became a prison for native leaders from the plains and the Southwest. Life there was not simply confinement. It was an attempt at transformation. Prisoners were given military-style discipline, forced routines, and instruction in English language and American customs. There were efforts to reshape identity through education, labor, and religious instruction. Some observers saw this as a form of civilization. For the Apache prisoners, it was something else entirely, a forced separation from land, culture, and the social systems that had defined their existence for generations. Among those imprisoned was Nate, along with other key figures from the final resistance. And even in captivity, leadership structures did not disappear completely. Apache prisoners continued to organize socially around familiar lines of respect, kinship, and shared experience, even when official authority attempted to replace those systems with military hierarchy. After several years at Fort Marion, the Apache prisoners were moved again, this time to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama. This second relocation marked a deepening of their exile. Florida had already been far from home, but Alabama was even more disconnected from the ecological and cultural environment of the Southwest. At Mount Vernon, conditions were difficult. Disease, unfamiliar climate, and limited resources created ongoing hardship. The Apache were not accustomed to the humidity, the agricultural conditions, or the restrictions placed on movement. Work assignments and ration systems were imposed, but they did not align with traditional Apache survival systems, which had always depended on mobility and adaptation rather than fixed labor structures. At the same time, something important was happening in the broader United States policy toward Native peoples. The government was increasingly experimenting with what it called assimilation policies, which meant attempting to absorb Indigenous peoples into American society through education, labor training, and cultural replacement rather than open warfare. This was the same period when institutions like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School were being established, where Native children from many different nations were taken from their families and placed into boarding schools designed to erase language and cultural identity. The logic behind this system was not military conquest anymore, but cultural transformation. For the Apache prisoners, however, assimilation was not something that felt like transition. It felt like disappearance. And yet even under these conditions, Apache identity did not dissolve. Instead, it adapted in quieter ways. Language continued to be spoken in private. Stories were preserved. Kinship ties remained intact. And memory itself became a form of resistance. One of the most important and controversial figures in this period was again Geronimo, who became something of a public symbol in the United States. Unlike many of the other prisoners, Geronimo was occasionally taken to public events, exhibitions, and fairs where he was displayed as a representation of the defeated Apache warrior. To American audiences, he was often presented as a living symbol of the end of the frontier era. To himself, and his people. This transformation into spectacle was another form of captivity, one that turned lived history into performance for audiences who had never experienced the reality of the conflict. During these years, Apache prisoners were moved once again, this time to Fort Sill in what is now Oklahoma, a region that would become central to the final long-term settlement of the Chiricahua Apache people. Fort Sill became the final major relocation site for the group. Unlike the earlier forts, Fort Sill gradually became less of a pure prison environment and more of a controlled settlement area. But even here, the transition was not simple. The Apache had been moved far from their ancestral lands, and the environment of the southern plains was still not the same as the mountain and desert ecosystems they had known for centuries. Over time, however, something changed slowly and unevenly. The Apache began to rebuild forms of community within the constraints of captivity and relocation. Children grew up in these new environments. Families reformed. Leadership adapted to the realities of life under military supervision. And although the original world of independent bands moving through the Southwest was gone, Apache identity did not vanish. Instead, it transformed into something that carried both memory and adaptation at the same time. In 1894, several years after the final surrender, the Apache prisoners were moved again as part of a broader relocation of indigenous groups. Some were transferred to the Fort Sill region permanently, while others were briefly moved or reassigned, depending on federal policy decisions that shifted with changing administrations. The key reality was that the Apache people had been removed from the war, but they had not been restored to sovereignty. They were now living under federal control in a system that defined them as wards of the government rather than independent nations. As the 20th century approached, the world around them was changing rapidly. The frontier period was officially declared closed by American historians. Railroads, towns, and industrial expansion transformed the Southwest. The landscapes where Apache resistance had once unfolded were now part of a settled national geography. But inside Apache communities, the memory of that world remained very real. Geronimo lived his final years under U.S. supervision, moving between Fort Sill and other controlled environments. He participated in public events, met American leaders, and became widely known across the United States. But he never returned to freedom in the way his earlier life had defined it. In 1909, he died at Fort Sill after an illness, still technically a prisoner of war at the time of his death. His death marked not just the end of a life, but the closing of an entire era of armed Apache resistance that had lasted for centuries across Spanish, Mexican, and American rule. But the Apache people did not end there. In 1913, the U.S. government finally allowed surviving members of the Chiricahua Apache prisoners of war to leave Fort Sill. Some chose to remain in Oklahoma, where they had built new lives over decades. Others moved to reservations in the Southwest, including lands in Arizona and New Mexico, reconnecting in partial ways with their ancestral geography. This return was not a restoration of the old world. It was something different, a continuation under new conditions. The landscapes were familiar, but the political reality was not. The freedom of movement that had defined Apache identity for centuries was no longer possible in the same way. But cultural identity, language, and community structure continued. Even after everything that had happened, Apache society persisted. The story of the Apache, when seen across its full arc from migration, adaptation, resistance, and survival, does not end with military defeat. It ends with transformation under pressure so extreme that very few societies in history have experienced anything comparable. And that is where the final part of this story will take us, into the legacy of the Apache people in the modern era, how memory of resistance survives, and how a nation that was once defined by movement across deserts and mountains continues to exist in a world that tried to stop that movement completely. By the time the Apache prisoners of war were finally released in the early 20th century, the United States had already moved into a new era that no longer resembled the frontier world in which their resistance had been forged. Railroads crossed the continent, cities expanded rapidly, and the Southwest had been fully absorbed into a national system of states, borders, and permanent settlements. But for the Apache people, the end of the wars did not mean the end of history. It meant the beginning of a different kind of struggle, one that was no longer defined by military campaigns, but by the challenge of preserving identity, language, and cultural continuity inside a world that had been permanently transformed. When the remaining Chiricahua Apache were allowed to leave military custody in 1913, they were given a choice that was itself shaped by decades of displacement. Some chose to remain in Oklahoma near Fort Sill, where they had spent years building new communities under restricted conditions. Others traveled back toward the Southwest, seeking to reconnect with ancestral homelands in Arizona and New Mexico, even though those lands were no longer controlled or used in the same way as they had been before. This return was not a simple homecoming. It was a reintroduction into a landscape that had changed politically, economically, and socially. Towns now stood where seasonal camps had once existed. Ranches, rail lines, and military forts had restructured the geography of movement. Water sources and hunting grounds were no longer part of an open system, but part of regulated land ownership and government administration. And yet, despite these changes, Apache identity persisted in ways that could not be fully erased by policy or relocation. One of the most important aspects of this survival was language. Apache languages, part of the broader Athabascan linguistic family, continued to be spoken within families and communities, even during periods when external systems discouraged or outright punished indigenous language use. Children were often sent to boarding schools where they were expected to adopt English and abandon traditional speech, but within homes and communities, Apache language remained a carrier of memory, history, and cultural logic. Alongside language, oral tradition played a central role. Stories of migration, resistance, leadership, and survival were passed down across generations. These are not simply historical accounts. They were frameworks for understanding identity, teaching values, and maintaining continuity with ancestors who had lived through centuries of change. The memory of leaders like Geronimo and Nate did not disappear after their deaths. Instead, they became part of a larger cultural memory that included both resistance and adaptation. In Apache communities, these figures are not understood in the simplified way they are often portrayed in outside narratives. They are part of a complex history that includes diplomacy, survival, conflict, loss, and endurance. At the same time, Apache communities began to adapt to new economic and political realities. Many families moved into wage labor systems, working in ranching, farming, railroads, and later in military and public service roles. Others maintained more traditional forms of subsistence where possible, combining older practices of land knowledge with newer economic systems. Reservation life, which had once been imposed as a tool of control, gradually became the primary social structure for many Apache communities. But even within reservations, there was variation. Different Apache groups maintained distinct identities, histories, and leadership structures, reflecting the fact that the Apache were never a single centralized nation, but a network of related but independent groups. In the decades that followed, Apache communities also became increasingly involved in legal and political efforts to assert rights over land, resources, and cultural recognition. These efforts were often long and complex, involving negotiations with federal agencies, court cases, and political advocacy. The struggle had shifted from battlefield resistance to institutional engagement, but the underlying goal remained the same: protecting autonomy and cultural survival. Education also became a key battleground. For much of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, federal policy aimed to assimilate indigenous children through boarding schools. But over time, Apache communities, like many other native nations, worked to regain control over education, language instruction, and cultural curriculum. This process was slow and uneven, but it marked an important shift from imposed education to community-driven learning. By the mid-20th century, Apache people were serving in the United States military, participating in national politics, and contributing to broader American society while still maintaining distinct cultural identities. This dual reality, being both part of the United States and part of a separate indigenous cultural world, became a defining feature of modern Apache life. At the same time, historians and anthropologists began to study Apache history more systematically. Early accounts often reflected the biases of military records or settler narratives, portraying the Apache primarily through the lens of conflict. Over time, however, more nuanced scholarship emerged that recognized Apache agency, complexity, and the long historical context of migration, adaptation, and resistance. This shift in understanding helped reframe Apache history not as a story of defeat, but as a long process of survival under extreme pressure, where cultural continuity persisted despite repeated attempts at disruption. In contemporary times, Apache nations continue to exist as sovereign tribal governments within the United States. These include groups such as the San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation and other federally recognized Apache communities across Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. These communities manage their own governance structures, cultural programs, and economic development initiatives. They also engage in ongoing efforts to preserve language, restore cultural practices, and educate younger generations about their history. Modern Apache identity is not a frozen remnant of the past. It is a living and evolving system that continues to adapt to new realities while maintaining continuity with historical experience. The legacy of centuries of resistance is still present, not as ongoing warfare, but as memory and identity shaped by the knowledge that survival itself was once an act of sustained resistance across multiple empires and states. And perhaps one of the most important truths about Apache history is that it cannot be reduced to a single ending. The Spanish period, the Mexican period, the American military campaigns, and the reservation era are all chapters in a much longer story of movement, adaptation, and endurance that begins long before European contact and continues into the present day. Even figures like Geronimo, whose life is often framed through the lens of war, represent something broader within Apache history. They are part of a continuum of leadership, survival, and response to changing conditions, rather than isolated symbols of conflict. Today, Apache communities continue to navigate the balance between modern life and cultural preservation, between integration and sovereignty, between historical memory and future development. And in doing so, they carry forward a legacy that was shaped in deserts, mountains, and borderlands over many centuries. The story of the Apache, when seen in full, is not only a history of resistance against Spanish, Mexican, and American expansion. It is also a history of adaptation under pressure, of identity maintained across displacement, and of a people whose existence continues long after the wars that once defined them. And that is where this history, for now, reaches its closing reflection, not as an end of the Apache story itself, but as the end of one long chapter in a living history that is still unfolding today. Long after the wars were declared over, and long after the last shots of the Apache resistance had faded into memory, the landscape of the American Southwest continued to carry the imprint of everything that had happened there. Not in the form of battlefields or monuments alone, but in the deeper structure of place itself, the rivers, the mountain passes, the desert routes, and the invisible knowledge systems that had once defined how entire communities moved through that land. Even as the United States expanded into a modern industrial nation, the Apache people remained rooted in a history that had never been fully resolved, only transformed. The story that began with migration across the northern continent, developed through centuries of adaptation, and reached its most intense phase in the long conflicts with Spain, Mexico, and the United States, did not conclude with surrender or relocation. It continued in a different form, carried in memory, language, and identity. By the early 20th century, as Apache families began to settle into life across reservations and new communities, the presence of the past remained constant. Elders still spoke of the old routes through the mountains and deserts, of seasonal cycles that once determined movement, of alliances and conflicts that shaped survival long before the arrival of external powers. These are not abstract stories. They were lived memory, passed down as instruction and identity. At Fort Sill, where many of the Chiricahua Apache had been held for years after their surrender, generations grew up under conditions that were neither fully imprisonment nor fully freedom. Children were born into a world where military supervision was part of daily life. Yet within that structure, Apache identity continued to form. Families maintained kinship systems. Language persisted in private spaces. Cultural memory was preserved even when public expression was restricted. Among those whose names became central to the memory of this period was Nate, who lived through the transition from armed resistance to captivity and then into the long aftermath of relocation. His life, like that of many others, reflected the broader transformation of Apache society from independent bands moving across vast territories to communities adapting within fixed boundaries imposed by external governance. And always in the background of this history remained the figure of Geronimo, whose name had already become widely known across the United States during his lifetime. In American public culture, he was often reduced to a symbol, a representation of the end of the frontier, but within Apache memory, his story is more complex. It is not only about resistance or surrender, but about the impossible conditions under which survival decisions were made over and over again across decades of pressure, displacement, and uncertainty. When Geronimo died at Fort Sill in 1909, he was still under guard, still technically a prisoner of war in the administrative sense. His death marked the end of a direct living link to the era of armed Apache resistance, but did not mark the end of Apache history. Instead, it became one point in a much longer continuum of survival and transformation. In the decades that followed, Apache communities continued to adapt to the rapidly changing world around them. The Southwest itself was being reshaped by railroads, highways, mining industries, and expanding urban centers. Land that had once been traversed seasonally and freely was now divided into states, counties, private property, and federal reservations. But within this transformed geography, Apache identity continued to exist as something that could not be fully mapped or contained. One of the most important developments in the 20th century was the gradual strengthening of tribal governance systems. Apache nations worked to reassert sovereignty within the legal framework of the United States, forming councils, managing resources, and negotiating with federal agencies over land, water, and cultural rights. This was no longer a military struggle, but a political and legal one, carried out through courts, legislation, and institutional negotiation. At the same time, cultural revitalization efforts began to grow stronger. Language preservation became a central focus, as communities recognized that language was not just communication, but the structure of thought, memory, and worldview. Ceremonial practices that had survived in private or limited forms began to be revitalized in more open community settings. Oral histories were recorded, taught, and passed on in new educational formats. The creation and expansion of reservation-based governance systems, such as those on the San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation, became central to this process. These communities became not just places of residence, but centers of cultural continuity, political organization, and economic development. In modern times, Apache people serve in many roles across American society, including military service, education, medicine, law, politics, and the arts. This reflects a reality that is often overlooked in simplified historical narratives, that indigenous identity and participation in modern institutions are not contradictory, but coexist in complex and evolving ways. Yet even as Apache communities engage fully in contemporary life, the memory of historical experience remains present. The centuries of migration from the north, the adaptation to the southwest, the long resistance against Spanish colonial expansion, the conflicts with Mexico, and the final wars with the United States are not distant past events. They are part of an ongoing narrative of identity that continues to shape cultural understanding today. Historians now increasingly recognize that the Apache story cannot be understood as a simple sequence of conquest and defeat. It is better understood as a long-term process of adaptation under extreme external pressure, where continuity was maintained not through static preservation, but through constant change and response. Even the figure of Geronimo has been re-examined in more recent scholarship and within Apache communities themselves, rather than a mythic final warrior or symbolic endpoint of resistance. He is understood as part of a broader historical reality in which decisions were made under conditions of displacement, uncertainty, and survival constraint. The same applies to Nate and other leaders of the final Apache resistance period, whose actions were shaped not only by warfare, but by negotiation, cultural responsibility, and the need to protect families and communities in a rapidly collapsing world of independent movement. Today, Apache identity continues to evolve. Younger generations grow up in a world shaped by technology, global communication, and modern education systems, yet still connected to ancestral land, language, and history. Cultural programs, language classes, and community initiatives continue to strengthen ties between past and present. What makes the Apache story unique is not only its long history of resistance, but its continuity beyond the conditions that once defined that resistance. Many societies in history have faced conquest or displacement. Far fewer have maintained cultural coherence across centuries of pressure from multiple imperial systems, while continuing to exist as living communities in the present. The Apache did not disappear into history. They moved through it, were shaped by it, resisted it, and adapted within it, but remained present throughout every stage. So when we look back at the full arc of this history, from northern origins through migration, through centuries of conflict with empires, through imprisonment and relocation, and into the modern era, what we are really seeing is not a closed chapter, but an ongoing process. The deserts, mountains, and borderlands that once defined Apache movement are still there. The languages are still spoken. The communities still exist. The memory of resistance is still carried forward, not as a relic of the past, but as part of living identity. And that is the final truth of this story. It does not end with conquest. It does not end with surrender. It does not end with imprisonment. It continues, because the Apache people continue. And history, in their case, was never something that ended at all, but something that was carried forward into the present, and still moves, still lives, and still evolves today. At the end of every long history, there is a temptation to look for a clean conclusion, a moment where everything feels resolved, where conflict becomes closure and movement becomes stillness. But the history of the Apache does not offer that kind of ending because it was never built around a single event, a single defeat, or a single transformation. Instead, it is a history built across centuries, shaped by migration, adaptation, resistance, and survival under changing empires and political systems that each tried, in different ways, to control or redefine their existence. From their earliest known movements, the ancestors of the Apache were already in motion, part of the broader northern Athabascan-speaking world that extended across regions that are now Western Canada and Alaska. This origin is not just a geographical detail. It is the foundation of a much larger pattern in Apache history, the ability to move, adapt, and rebuild identity across environments that were constantly changing. As these groups gradually moved southward over generations, they did not simply migrate into empty land. They entered regions already inhabited by diverse indigenous nations with their own systems, languages, and histories. The Apache identity that eventually formed in the Southwest was not a sudden creation, but the result of long interaction, adaptation, and differentiation across centuries of movement and settlement. By the time Spanish forces entered the American Southwest in the 16th century, Apache societies were already well established in the region's mountains, deserts, and plains. They were not a new arrival to the historical stage of the Southwest. They were already part of its deep and complex human geography. What followed over the next 3 centuries was not a single continuous war, but a layered series of encounters with Spanish, then Mexican, and finally United States authorities. Each of these powers brought different systems of governance, different military strategies, and different ideological frameworks for understanding land and sovereignty. The Spanish introduced missions, presidios, and a colonial religious framework that sought conversion and labor control. The Apache response combined resistance, adaptation, raiding, and selective interaction depending on circumstance. The Mexican period that followed introduced new instability, weaker centralized control, and intensified frontier conflict, including devastating cycles of violence and retaliatory raids on both sides. Then came the United States, bringing industrial-scale military capability, rail networks, telegraph communication, and an ideological commitment to continental expansion under what was known as Manifest Destiny. This period marked the most intense phase of sustained pressure on Apache independence, not because it was the only conflict, but because it combined scale, technology, and administrative continuity in ways that earlier empires had not fully achieved. Within this long arc, leaders such as Geronimo and Nate emerged not as isolated figures of conflict, but as participants in a much larger historical process shaped by displacement, broken agreements, survival decisions, and the constant restructuring of Apache society under external pressure. Their actions cannot be separated from the conditions of their time. They were responding to systems that repeatedly disrupted Apache life, whether through forced relocation, reservation confinement, military campaigns, or the breakdown of negotiated agreements. In this sense, their role in history is inseparable from the broader structural forces that define the era. When the armed resistance finally ended in the late 19th century, it did not represent the disappearance of a people, but the end of one specific form of struggle. The surrender at Skeleton Canyon, the imprisonment at places like Fort Sill, and the later relocations marked a transition from military conflict to administrative control, from movement across land to confinement within legal and institutional boundaries. But even within these constraints, Apache identity did not dissolve. It adapted. It restructured itself around new realities while maintaining continuity with older forms of meaning, kinship, language, and cultural practice. The 20th century brought further transformation. Apache communities became part of broader economic systems, national institutions, and political structures within the United States. Yet at the same time, they continued to assert sovereignty through tribal governance, cultural preservation, and legal recognition. Reservations such as the San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation became central to this process, serving not only as residential areas, but as political and cultural centers where identity could be maintained and strengthened in new forms. Language preservation, education reform, and cultural revitalization efforts became key priorities. Oral history traditions continued to transmit knowledge across generations, ensuring that historical memory remained active rather than abstract. These stories carried not only accounts of conflict and survival, but also teachings about land, responsibility, and community structure. In modern scholarship, there has been a significant shift in how Apache history is understood. Earlier narratives often framed it as a linear story of conflict leading to inevitable defeat. Contemporary perspectives instead emphasize complexity, agency, and continuity. The Apache are now understood not as a people defined by war alone, but as societies that navigated centuries of transformation under extreme external pressure while maintaining cultural persistence. This does not erase the violence or suffering that occurred. The massacres, forced relocations, broken treaties, and prolonged military campaigns remain central to the historical record. But they are now understood within a broader framework that recognizes both destruction and endurance at the same time. The story of Geronimo in particular has undergone reinterpretation. Rather than being viewed solely as a final defeated warrior figure, he is increasingly understood as part of a longer historical continuum in which leadership meant navigating impossible constraints, making decisions under conditions of extreme pressure, and responding to repeated cycles of broken trust and survival necessity. The same applies to Nate and other leaders of the final resistance period, whose lives reflect the broader complexity of Apache society during its most difficult transition. Today, Apache nations continue to exist as living communities with their own governments, cultural systems, and social structures. They are not historical remnants. They are contemporary societies shaped by history, but not confined to it. Their existence challenges simplistic ideas about conquest and disappearance. It shows that even after centuries of displacement, conflict, and forced change, identity can persist, adapt, and continue into new forms. And so the full arc of Apache history does not end in the 19th century, or with the surrender of armed resistance, or even with relocation and imprisonment. It extends into the present moment, where Apache communities continue to define themselves, protect their languages, and maintain cultural continuity while navigating the realities of the modern world. The story that began with movement across northern landscapes expanded through centuries of adaptation in the Southwest, passed through Spanish colonization, Mexican instability, and American expansion, and endured through war, imprisonment, and relocation, ultimately arrives here not as an ending, but as a continuation. Because the most important truth of all is this: the Apache story was never something that stopped. It was something that survived, and is still being written today. When we step back from the long timeline of Apache history, what becomes most striking is not a single battle, a single leader, or a single moment of surrender, but the sheer duration of continuity across radically different worlds. This is a history that begins long before European contact, passes through 3 major imperial systems, and continues into a modern nation-state that is still evolving today. It is easy, especially in simplified historical narratives, to treat the Apache story as if it belongs only to the 19th century, centered around warfare in the American Southwest. But that view misses the deeper structure of the story entirely. The Apache were not defined by war. They were defined by movement, adaptation, and the ability to survive across changing ecological, political, and cultural systems over an extraordinary span of time. From their northern origins within the broader Athabascan-speaking world, their gradual migration southward was not a single migration event, but a long generational process. Over time, environmental knowledge, social structures, and cultural practices adapted to new landscapes. By the time Apache groups became established in the Southwest, they were already a distinct collection of societies shaped by both continuity and change. When Spanish colonial expansion reached the region, it did not encounter static or isolated people. It encountered complex indigenous societies already engaged in networks of trade, conflict, and cooperation. The arrival of Spanish missions, presidios, and livestock systems introduced new pressures and new opportunities, including trade relationships, raiding cycles, and shifting alliances that would define the colonial period for centuries. Later, under Mexican rule, instability and weakened central authority intensified frontier conflict. The collapse of strong regional control led to expanded cycles of raiding and retaliation, but also to moments of negotiation and coexistence. This period was not simply chaos. It was a fluid frontier system where survival depended on constant adaptation to shifting power structures. Then came the United States, bringing industrial military capability, expanded settlement systems, and a national ideology of continental expansion. This period intensified pressure on Apache autonomy more than any previous era, not only through military force, but through infrastructure, legal systems, and long-term settlement patterns that permanently altered the geography of movement. Within this final phase of armed resistance, figures such as Geronimo and Nate became part of a closing chapter of direct military confrontation. Their actions cannot be separated from the historical conditions that shaped them, including repeated cycles of broken agreements, forced relocation, and the collapse of trust between Apache communities and external authorities. When armed resistance ended and individuals were relocated to places such as Fort Sill, it marked not the disappearance of Apache society, but a forced transition into a new structure of life. The transformation from mobile autonomous bands to confined or reservation-based communities represented one of the most significant structural changes in Apache history, but it did not eliminate cultural continuity. Instead, Apache identity shifted into new forms. Language, kinship, oral tradition, and cultural knowledge became the core mechanisms of survival. These systems had always existed, but they became even more important once physical movement was restricted. Memory itself became a form of continuity. Over time, Apache communities established modern tribal governments with institutions that manage land, resources, education, and cultural preservation. Places like the San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation became centers of both governance and cultural resilience, where historical memory and modern political organization exist side by side. The legacy of this history is not only about what was lost, but also about what endured. Despite centuries of pressure from multiple colonial and national systems, Apache communities remain active, sovereign, and culturally distinct. This continuity is not accidental. It reflects sustained effort across generations to maintain identity under conditions designed to disrupt it. In this sense, Apache history offers a broader lesson about human societies under pressure. It shows that cultural survival does not always depend on uninterrupted sovereignty or territorial control. It can also exist through adaptation, memory, and the rebuilding of community structures in new environments. It also challenges simple narratives of conquest and disappearance. The end of armed resistance in 1886 did not mean the end of Apache society. It marked the end of one phase of struggle and the beginning of another, less visible but equally significant phase focused on survival within institutional systems that replaced open warfare with legal and administrative control. Even figures like Geronimo, whose name is often used as a symbol of final resistance, cannot be fully understood outside this broader continuum. His life reflects both the intensity of conflict and the complexity of survival under conditions that left very few good options available at any stage. The same is true for Nate and others who lived through the transition from autonomy to confinement. Their experiences are part of a larger historical pattern in which leadership was defined not only by warfare, but by the responsibility of guiding communities through irreversible change. Today, Apache nations continue to exist as living societies within the United States, maintaining sovereignty, governance, cultural practice, and identity. They are not historical echoes. They are contemporary communities shaped by a long and complex past, but fully present in the modern world. And perhaps the most important understanding that emerges from this entire history is that it cannot be reduced to a single ending point. It is not a story that concludes with conquest, surrender, imprisonment, or assimilation. It is a story that continues through each of those transformations, adapting and persisting across time. The deserts, mountains, and rivers that once defined Apache movement still exist. The languages still carry meaning. The communities still function, and the memory of centuries of survival remains embedded in identity, not as distant history, but as lived inheritance. So when we speak about the Apache in full historical perspective, we are not speaking about a closed chapter of the past. We are speaking about a living continuity that stretches from ancient migration to present-day communities, from early adaptation to modern governance, from survival under empire to existence within a global world. And that is the final reflection this history leaves us with. Not an ending, not a disappearance, but endurance across time itself. When we step back from the history of the Apache and place it inside a much older timeline of human civilization, something important begins to appear. Their story, while unique in its details, is not unique in its pattern. It is part of a much older human experience that stretches far beyond the American Southwest, far beyond the age of Spain, Mexico, or the United States, and even far beyond written history itself. Because long before the Apache migrated south from the northern regions of North America, and long before any European empire ever reached the continent, There were already countless societies across the ancient world living through the same fundamental forces that shaped Apache history. Movement, pressure, adaptation, survival. These are not modern or regional experiences. They are ancient human conditions. If we travel far back in time to the earliest known nomadic civilizations in Eurasia, we find patterns that feel strikingly familiar. Groups like the early steppe peoples of Central Asia lived in constant motion across vast landscapes, much like the Apache would later do in North America. They followed seasonal resources, relied on deep environmental knowledge, and built societies that were not fixed in cities but spread across territories through mobility and kinship networks. Like the Apache, their strength was not centralized power, but flexibility. Not permanent structures, but adaptability. Not rigid borders, but movement through land that they understood intimately. And like the Apache centuries later, these ancient nomadic societies often came into contact and conflict with expanding empires that sought to control land, restrict movement, and replace fluid systems of survival with fixed administrative order. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the Roman frontier zones, in the expansion of Chinese dynasties, and across countless other historical regions, we see the same pattern repeating again and again. A mobile people shaped by land, and an expanding empire shaped by control. One values movement, the other values stability. One survives through flexibility, the other survives through structure. And when these two systems collide, history almost always enters a long period of tension, misunderstanding, and conflict. This is what makes the Apache story so important to understand in a broader sense. It is not just a regional conflict between indigenous peoples and colonial powers in North America. It is one expression of a much older global pattern, where mobile societies and expansionist states repeatedly struggle to coexist under the same land systems. Even the idea of raiding, which is often misunderstood in simplified historical accounts, has deep ancient parallels. In many early societies around the world, raiding was not seen purely as criminal behavior, but as an economic and social mechanism in environments where centralized supply systems did not exist or were unreliable. This does not erase the violence of those conflicts, but helps explain why they occurred repeatedly across different cultures and time periods. And when we return to the Apache within this wider lens, something changes in how their story is understood. Their centuries of adaptation are no longer just a local history of one group in one region. They become part of a much larger human question. What happens when a mobile society that depends on land knowledge and movement is forced into a world of borders, property systems, and permanent settlement? That question did not begin with the Apache, and it did not end with them either. It appears in ancient steppe migrations. It appears in the frontier zones of empires. It appears in desert societies across Africa and the Middle East. And it appears again in modern history wherever expansion meets mobility. The Apache story simply happens to be one of the most well-documented examples of this pattern in the modern era. And this is where the deeper connection emerges. Because what we are really looking at is not just Apache history anymore. It is a repeating structure of human civilization itself. A structure where movement meets control, where adaptation meets expansion, where survival meets system building. And in every version of that encounter across history, the outcome is never simple victory or simple defeat. It is transformation, sometimes violent, sometimes slow, sometimes incomplete, but always transformative. And that is the real bridge between the Apache story and the ancient world. Not similarity of culture, not similarity of weapons, not similarity of geography, but similarity of pressure. The pressure of change, the pressure of expansion, the pressure of survival in a world that refuses to stay still. And once we understand that, the Apache story stops being only a regional history and becomes something much older, a reflection of a pattern that has been repeating since the earliest movements of human beings across the earth. When we look back at the Apache story, and then further back into ancient human history, something begins to emerge that is deeper than any single empire, any single war, or any single people. It is a pattern that repeats so often across time that it almost feels like a law of history itself. The moment human beings began organizing into large, stable civilizations, something else also began to exist alongside them. Not as an enemy in the simple sense, and not as a separate world, but as a parallel system of life that moved differently, survived differently, and understood land differently. That system is what historians often call nomadic life. And long before the Apache ever existed in North America, this same form of life had already shaped some of the most important turning points in ancient history. If we go back thousands of years to the Eurasian steppe, a massive open landscape stretching from Eastern Europe to Central Asia, we find societies that lived in ways that would feel deeply familiar in structure, even if not in culture. These were people who did not build permanent cities in the way ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt did. Instead, they built life around movement, seasonal migration, animal herding, and deep environmental knowledge. They did not see land as something to be owned in fixed boundaries. They saw land as something to be traveled through, understood, and shared across time. And this created a completely different kind of society. Because when your survival depends on movement, everything in your culture becomes designed around flexibility. Leadership becomes less about permanent rulers and more about respected guides. Economy becomes less about stored surplus and more about shared resources and mobility. Warfare, when it happens, becomes less about holding territory and more about controlling access, routes, and survival paths. This structure existed long before recorded history fully captured it in detail, but its effects are visible in the rise and fall of entire ancient empires. Because again and again, when large centralized civilizations expanded outward, they encountered these mobile societies at their edges. And what followed was never simple. Sometimes there was trade, sometimes alliance, sometimes absorption, sometimes total conflict. But almost always, there was tension between two completely different ways of living. One system depended on permanent settlement, agriculture, taxation, and fixed borders. The other system depended on movement, adaptation, environmental reading, and fluid territory. This is where the deeper connection to the Apache story becomes clearer. Because when Spanish, Mexican, and later American systems expanded into the Southwest, they were not just encountering a local group of people. They were encountering an ancient type of human system that has existed in different forms across continents and across thousands of years. The Apache, like many nomadic or semi-nomadic societies in history, were not structured around permanent centralized authority. Their organization was flexible, distributed, and deeply tied to land knowledge rather than fixed infrastructure. And this is why so many empires struggled to fully control them for so long. Because you cannot easily capture a system that is designed not to stay in one place. You can pressure it, you can disrupt it, you can force transformation, but you cannot simply remove it in a single moment. And this is something ancient history shows again and again. When the Roman Empire expanded into frontier regions of Europe and North Africa, it encountered tribal and mobile groups that resisted full integration. When Chinese dynasties expanded westward, they encountered steppe peoples who moved in ways that made traditional military control extremely difficult. When Islamic empires expanded across deserts and mountain regions, they encountered societies shaped by movement and seasonal survival systems. In each case, the pattern repeats. The more civilization expands into fixed control systems, the more it encounters societies that do not naturally fit into those systems. And the result is never one-sided. It is always a long process of pressure, adaptation, resistance, and transformation on both sides. Now, when we return to the Apache inside this larger pattern, something important becomes clear. Their story is not unusual because they resisted. Their story is powerful because they sustained identity through repeated waves of pressure that came from multiple empires across centuries. Spanish colonial expansion did not eliminate them. Mexican frontier instability did not eliminate them. United States military expansion did not eliminate them. Each phase changed them. Each phase reshaped them. Each phase forced adaptation. But none of them fully erased continuity. And that is what connects them to the oldest patterns of human civilization. Because across history, the societies that survive long-term are rarely the ones that remain unchanged. They're the ones that adapt without disappearing. They're the ones that transform without breaking completely. And the Apache story, when viewed this way, becomes less about a single conflict in the American Southwest, and more about one of the oldest questions in human history. What happens when a mobile, land-connected society is forced into a world of fixed borders, permanent control, and expanding centralized systems? And that question does not belong to one era. It belongs to all eras, because it has been asked in deserts, in steppes, in mountains, in forests, and in borderlands across the entire span of human history. And every time it is asked, the answer is different in detail, but similar in structure. Pressure, adaptation, conflict, survival, transformation. If we continue following this pattern of history far beyond the Apache story, one of the clearest and most dramatic examples appears not in North America, but across the vast landmass of Eurasia, in what historians often call the Great Steppe world. This is the same general environmental type that shaped many of the earliest large-scale nomadic societies, stretching across regions that are now parts of Mongolia, Kazakhstan, southern Russia, and northern China. And in this environment, a very similar historical dynamic unfolded again. On one side stood large settled civilizations. Ancient China, with its dynasties, written administration, fortified borders, and agricultural base. Ancient Persia, with its empire structure, taxation systems, and centralized rule. Later, parts of Europe, with expanding kingdoms and developing feudal systems. And on the other side stood mobile steppe societies whose survival depended on horses, seasonal migration, and deep knowledge of open terrain. These were not small societies in any simple sense. In fact, some of the most powerful military forces in ancient and medieval history came from these steppe worlds. What made them powerful was not buildings or cities, but mobility itself. When a society can move quickly across vast distances, when it can survive off the land, when its military structure is built around mounted movement rather than static defense, it becomes extremely difficult for settled empires to predict, contain, or fully control. And this is where one of the most important historical figures in this entire pattern appears. Genghis Khan. He did not create the nomadic system of the steppe, but he unified it in a way that transformed it into one of the most powerful forces the world had ever seen. Under his leadership and the generations that followed, the Mongol Empire expanded across enormous regions of Asia and into Europe, not because it was larger in population than its opponents, but because it mastered the logic of mobility, coordination, and psychological warfare at a scale that settled empires were not prepared for. But even here, the deeper pattern remains the same. The Mongol system, like earlier steppe societies, was built on movement, adaptation, and decentralized but highly effective military organization. And when it expanded into settled civilizations, it encountered exactly the same structural tension that we saw later in the Apache story. Two different ways of organizing life. Two different relationships to land. Two different definitions of control. And when these systems collide, the outcome is never just military. It is always structural. Cities fall, but systems adapt. Empires expand, but also transform under pressure from the very societies they encounter. Trade networks emerge even during conflict. New political structures form out of necessity. And over time, the boundary between nomadic and settled becomes less absolute and more mixed. Because what history shows again and again is that these two systems do not exist in pure isolation. They reshape each other. Now, when we return to the Apache story with this in mind, something very important becomes clearer. The Apache were not a small, isolated exception in history. They were one regional expression of a much larger and older human pattern. A pattern where mobility is not chaos, but structure. Where movement is not disorder, but survival intelligence. Where leadership is not always centralized, but distributed through trust, experience, and necessity. And when this kind of system meets expanding centralized power structures, the result is almost never immediate resolution. It is long tension, long misunderstanding, long cycles of conflict and adaptation. And this is exactly what happened in the Southwest over centuries. But now, instead of seeing it only as a local history, we begin to see it as part of a repeating global structure. And that structure has a consistent shape. A settled system expands outward. A mobile system already exists in that space. Both systems interpret land differently. Conflict emerges not just from violence, but from incompatible logic. And over time, one system does not simply erase the other. Instead, both are forced into transformation. This is the deeper historical truth that connects the Apache experience to ancient steppe societies and even further back into early human migration patterns. Because if we go back far enough, all humans were once mobile. All human societies began in movement. Settlement is relatively recent in the full timeline of human existence, which means that in a strange way, the Apache story is not an outlier. It is a reminder of something older that humanity never fully left behind. The tension between staying and moving, between controlling land and moving through it, between building permanence and living through adaptation. And that tension has never fully disappeared from human history. It simply changes form depending on the era. When we continue following this repeating pattern through history, we eventually arrive at another moment where the same forces appear again, but on an even larger scale and with consequences that reshaped entire continents. Because after the age of ancient empires and steppe expansions, the world did not stop producing collisions between mobile societies and expanding centralized powers. It simply changed the form of those powers. By the late medieval and early modern period, a new kind of global expansion began to take shape. It was no longer just regional empires expanding across neighboring lands. It was ocean-crossing empires built on navigation, firearms, trade networks, and large-scale colonial administration. And in this new era, the same structural tension reappeared, but now across multiple continents at the same time. One of the clearest examples of this pattern can be seen in the expansion of the Russian Empire across Siberia and Central Asia. As Russian expansion moved eastward, it encountered vast regions inhabited by indigenous and nomadic societies whose way of life was built around movement, seasonal migration, and deep environmental knowledge, very similar in structure, though not in culture, to what we saw in Apache society in North America. These societies included various Turkic, Mongolic, and other steppe-based peoples who had lived for centuries in fluid territorial systems rather than fixed borders. And once again, the same historical tension emerged. A centralized expanding state system encountered mobile societies that did not fit neatly into its administrative structure. The state sought taxation, fixed settlement, and political control. The mobile societies relied on movement, flexible boundaries, and ecological adaptation. And the result was not immediate disappearance of one side, but long periods of resistance, negotiation, forced integration, and cultural transformation. This same pattern also appears in the expansion of European colonial empires across Africa. In many regions of Africa, particularly in the Sahara, the Sahel, and parts of southern and eastern Africa, there were long-established pastoralist and semi-nomadic societies whose survival depended on movement across environmental zones that could not support permanent fixed settlement in the same way agricultural core regions could. When European colonial powers expanded into these regions, they attempted to impose borders, administrative districts, taxation systems, and settlement-based governance models that often conflicted directly with how these societies actually lived and moved. And again, The result was not simple replacement. It was pressure, adaptation, resistance, and partial transformation on both sides. In many cases, colonial borders cut directly through traditional movement routes, disrupting older systems that had existed for centuries. But even under these conditions, mobile societies did not simply vanish. They adapted in ways that allowed continuity under new constraints, even when those constraints were restrictive and often violent. Now, when we return to the Apache story with this global pattern in mind, something becomes even clearer. The Apache experience was not isolated, and it was not unique in structure. What made it historically important is that it unfolded in North America during a period where global expansion was reaching its most organized and technologically advanced form. By the time Spanish, Mexican, and later United States systems expanded into the Southwest, they were part of a much larger global process that was already transforming indigenous and mobile societies across the world. And this is where another important figure in global history helps illustrate the broader structure. Scramble for Africa. During this period, European powers rapidly divided nearly an entire continent into colonial territories, often without regard for existing cultural, linguistic, or ecological systems. Borders were drawn in ways that did not match how many societies actually moved, traded, or organized themselves. And in many regions, this created long-term structural tension between centralized state systems and communities whose survival depended on mobility or flexible land use. This is not identical to the Apache experience in detail, but it is similar in structure. And that is the key point, because across all of these historical examples, from North America to Eurasia to Africa, the same underlying pattern keeps appearing. A system based on fixed control expands into a system based on movement. And when they collide, neither side fully understands the other at first, because they're not just different cultures. There are different ways of organizing survival itself. One system believes land is something to be owned, mapped, and administered. The other system often understands land as something to be moved through, shared across time, and accessed through knowledge and relationship. And when these two ideas meet inside the same physical space, conflict becomes almost unavoidable. Not because one side is inherently more violent or more peaceful, but because the systems are built on different assumptions about how the world works. And this is the deeper connection back to the Apache story. Because the long history of Apache resistance, adaptation, negotiation, and survival was not happening in isolation. It was happening inside one of the largest global transformations in human history. A transformation where mobile and semi-nomadic societies across the world were being absorbed, restricted, or reorganized by expanding state systems that were becoming more powerful, more structured, and more global in reach. And yet, even within that process, survival continued in many places. Sometimes through adaptation, sometimes through forced change, sometimes through cultural preservation under new systems, and sometimes through the quiet persistence of identity even when political power was lost. Which brings us back to the central idea that has followed this entire story from the beginning. That history is not just a sequence of events. It is a repeating structure, and the Apache story is one of its clearest and most human examples. When we return one final time to the Apache story after moving through centuries of migration, colonial expansion, global empires, and repeating patterns of human civilization, something important happens to the way the story feels. It stops being only about the past, and it starts becoming a reflection of how history still works in the present. Because the Apache experience, when seen in full, is not just a story about conflict between one group and another group. It is a story about what happens when entire systems of life are forced to adapt under pressure from larger forces that are expanding across land, resources, and political structure. But unlike many historical narratives that end in disappearance, the Apache story does not end in erasure. It continues, and that continuation is not symbolic or abstract. It is real, living and present today in the form of modern Apache nations, communities, and cultural systems that still exist across the United States. This is where history often becomes misunderstood in simplified versions. Because people sometimes imagine that once armed conflict ends or once formal resistance stops, a culture also disappears or becomes finished in some historical sense. But what actually happens is something very different. What ends is one phase of expression. What continues is identity itself, reshaped under new conditions. And this is exactly what happened after the long period of Apache resistance and confinement during the late 19th century. Communities that had once moved across wide territories were gradually confined into reservation systems, such as San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation and other related regions. These places were not simply geographic boundaries. They became new political and cultural environments where Apache identity had to adapt once again, this time not to empire expansion in the open frontier, but to structured governance systems inside a modern nation-state. And this shift required a different kind of survival. Not survival through movement across land in the same way as earlier centuries, but survival through language, memory, family structure, governance, and cultural transmission. In this phase of history, oral tradition becomes even more important than before. Stories are no longer just historical memory. They become a living framework for identity. They carry knowledge about relationships to land, to ancestors, to community responsibility, and to the meaning of survival itself. And in this sense, Apache history does not end with the closing of military resistance. It transforms into cultural continuity under new conditions. At the same time, modern Apache communities also began engaging with legal, political, and educational systems that were not part of their original historical structure. Tribal governance develops as a way to assert sovereignty within the framework of the United States. Education systems are built not only to integrate into wider society, but also to preserve language and cultural knowledge. Cultural revitalization efforts become central to community life, ensuring that younger generations remain connected to identity that stretches far beyond modern political boundaries. And this is where the deeper meaning of the entire story becomes clear. Because if we step back far enough, the Apache story is not only about resistance to external powers. It is about continuity under transformation. It is about a society maintaining identity across radically different historical systems without disappearing into any single one of them completely. And when we compare this to the broader global patterns we explored earlier, something very important becomes visible. The same tension between mobility and control, between flexible systems and fixed systems, does not disappear in the modern world. It simply changes form again. Borders are now international instead of regional. Governance systems are now global in reach. Economic structures are now interconnected across continents. But the underlying question remains the same as it was in ancient times. How do societies maintain identity, autonomy, and continuity inside systems that are constantly expanding, restructuring, and redefining how land and resources are organized? The Apache story does not answer this question in a simple way. Instead, it shows one of the clearest examples of how a society can pass through multiple phases of pressure without losing continuity entirely. It shows that survival is not always about winning in a conventional sense. Sometimes it is about adaptation without disappearance. Sometimes it is about continuity inside transformation. And sometimes it is about preserving identity even when the external world around that identity changes completely. This is why the Apache story still matters today beyond historical interest, because it reflects a pattern that is still present in the modern world in different forms, whether in indigenous communities, in migration systems, in cultural preservation movements, or in any situation where identity and structure are forced to interact under pressure. And in that sense, the Apache are not only part of history. They are part of an ongoing human question about how societies survive change without losing themselves entirely. And that brings us to the final understanding of this entire narrative. Not a conclusion of events, but a recognition of continuity. Because the story we began with, of people moving through land, adapting to environments, resisting external pressure, and transforming across centuries, does not end in the past. It continues wherever human societies continue to face change, expansion, and adaptation. And that is why the Apache story remains important. Not because it is finished, but because it is still part of the world we live in now. When all the layers of this history are placed together, the ancient migrations, the movement into the American Southwest, the Spanish colonial encounters, the Mexican frontier wars, the United States expansion, the reservation era, and the modern survival of Apache identity, what remains is not just a story about one people in one region of the world. What remains is something much larger. It is a pattern of human existence that repeats across time, geography, and civilization. Because if we strip away the names of empires, if we remove the borders drawn on maps, and if we look only at the structure beneath the events, we begin to see something simple but powerful. Human history is shaped by movement and control existing in constant tension. On one side, there are societies that depend on flexibility, adaptation, and deep environmental knowledge, where survival is tied to understanding land as a living system rather than a fixed possession. On the other side, there are societies that depend on centralization, structure, and expansion, where survival is tied to administration, ownership, and permanent settlement. Neither system is unnatural. Neither system is accidental. Both emerge repeatedly wherever humans organize themselves in complex environments over long periods of time. And when these systems meet, history becomes unstable. Not because one side is good and the other is bad, but because they interpret the world in fundamentally different ways. The Apache story is one of the clearest, long-form examples of this interaction in recorded history. It shows what happens when a mobile, land knowledge-based society encounters multiple waves of expanding external systems over centuries, each bringing new technologies, new political structures, and new assumptions about what land and society should look like. But even more importantly, it shows that survival is not always defined by dominance. Survival can also be defined by continuity. Because while empires rise and fall, while borders shift, while political systems replace one another, identity does not always follow the same path. Sometimes identity persists beneath those changes. Sometimes it adapts into new forms. Sometimes it survives in memory, language, and community even when the original external conditions that shaped it no longer exist. And that is what makes the Apache story different from a simple war narrative. It is not just about conflict. It is about endurance across transformation. When we think back to figures like Geronimo or Nate, their lives are often remembered through the lens of the final phase of resistance. But in the broader historical sense, they represent something more complex than that. They represent the closing stage of a long process where one form of life was being pushed into another form of existence, and where decisions were being made under conditions that had already been shaped by centuries of external pressure. Their story is not separate from the earlier centuries of migration and adaptation. It is part of the same continuous thread. And when the armed resistance ended and communities were relocated to places such as Fort Sill, what changed was not the existence of Apache people, but the structure of the world they were now living inside. From that point forward, survival meant something different. It meant maintaining identity within systems that were no longer based on open movement across land, but on administrative governance, legal recognition, and cultural preservation. It meant adapting once again, not to desert or mountain or frontier alone, but to institutions that defined land, identity, and rights in entirely new ways. And yet, despite all of this transformation, Apache communities did not disappear. They remained. They reorganized. They rebuilt. They continued. And this continuity is what ultimately brings the entire story into focus. Because across all the centuries of change, from northern origins to southwestern settlement, from Spanish missions to Mexican frontiers, from United States military campaigns to modern reservation life. One thing never fully breaks. Identity persists through transformation. Not unchanged, not untouched, but continuous. And that is the final lesson that emerges from this entire historical arc. Not that conflict defines a people, not that resistance defines survival, but that survival itself is often a quiet, long-term process of adaptation across generations, far beyond the moments that history usually highlights. So when we look at the Apache story in full, what we are really seeing is not only a regional history of one indigenous people. We are seeing a reflection of a much older human reality, that societies change, systems expand and collide, environments shift, power structures rise and fall. But human identity, when rooted deeply enough in culture, memory, and community, can continue through all of it. And that is why this story does not end like a traditional ending. It does not close like a completed chapter. It continues like a living process. Because history itself, like the Apache experience, is never truly finished. It only keeps moving forward. At the end of this long journey through Apache history, through centuries of migration, adaptation, conflict, survival, and transformation, there is a temptation to look for a final moment that feels like closure. A single point where everything stops. A moment where history becomes still. But the truth of this story, when seen in full, is that it was never built around stillness in the first place. It was built around movement. From the earliest origins of the Apache ancestors in the northern regions of North America, movement defined survival. Generations carried knowledge southward across vast landscapes, not as a single migration event, but as a long unfolding process shaped by environment, opportunity, and adaptation. By the time Apache societies formed in the Southwest, they were already shaped by centuries of learning how to live with change rather than resist it. And when external powers eventually entered their world, first Spanish colonial systems, then Mexican frontier authority, and later the expanding United States, each one brought a different version of the same fundamental challenge. A challenge not just of territory, but of structure. Not just of control, but of worldview. One system saw land as something to be fixed, divided, owned, and administered. The other saw land as something to be lived within, moved through, and understood as a living relationship rather than a permanent possession. And when these two ways of understanding the world met in the same space, conflict did not come from misunderstanding alone. It came from incompatibility at the deepest level of how life was organized. Across centuries, this produced cycles of resistance, negotiation, adaptation, and transformation. Leaders rose in response to specific moments in this long timeline, including figures such as Geronimo and Nate, whose lives became symbols of the final phase of armed resistance during a period of overwhelming structural pressure. But even their stories do not stand alone. They are part of a continuous thread that stretches back far beyond the final battles, and far beyond the moment of surrender at places like Fort Sill, where relocation marked not disappearance, but forced transition into a new historical reality. Because what ended in that era was not Apache existence. What ended was one form of Apache life under one specific historical condition. What continued was something deeper. Identity, memory, community, adaptation. And this is where the story expands beyond the Apache themselves and becomes something more universal. Because when we look at the full arc, not just of this people, but of human societies across time, we begin to see that no culture exists in isolation from change. No society remains untouched by expansion, migration, environmental pressure, or political transformation. Everything in human history is shaped by contact, adaptation, and response. And in that sense, the Apache story is not an exception. It is an example, a deeply human example of what it means to persist through centuries of shifting worlds without fully breaking continuity. Not by remaining unchanged, but by refusing to disappear. And so the final understanding of this entire story is not about conquest or defeat. It is about endurance across time. It is about the ability of human identity to survive within systems that constantly try to reshape it. It is about the fact that history does not move in straight lines from beginning to end, but in overlapping layers of transformation that never fully erase what came before. The Apache story began with movement across land. It passed through centuries of encounter, conflict, adaptation, and survival. And it continues today in living communities that still carry language, memory, governance, and identity forward into the present world. So there is no final disappearance to describe, no final silence to record, no final ending in the way traditional stories sometimes suggest. Instead, there is something more accurate, a continuation, because the true ending of this story is not an ending at all. It is the recognition that is still unfolding, still living, still present, and still connected to the same human question that has existed since the beginning of time. How do people survive change without losing themselves completely? And the Apache story, across all its centuries, does not answer that question with words. It answers it with existence. And that is where this story ends. Not in disappearance, not in silence, but in continuity itself.